In today's tutorial, I'm going to show you how to create a colorful shadow that takes on the color of the image in front of it. This is to simulate the podcast app that comes with iOS. When you press play, the cover art pops up, revealing a shadow underneath that's the same color as the average color in the image. And then when you press stop, that image animates back down and becomes flat with a page. So get your coffee, because that's what we're doing today. Hey everybody, welcome back. Okay, no more Spanish. Sad face. My name is Alex, and if this is your first time here, please consider subscribing to this channel where you'll see lots of different tips, tricks, and tutorials. Today we're doing a tutorial, so don't miss any more like this. Click the subscribe button and click the little notification bell so you get notified when those tutorials come out. And if you're learning NativeScript and you want more in-depth knowledge, check out the link below in the description to nativescripting.com. There's a coupon code down below where you can get courses that target different frameworks. We have NativeScript Core courses, NativeScript Angular courses, and NativeScript Vue courses. So grab one of those courses and take your NativeScript knowledge to the next level. So we're going to be looking at writing JavaScript code to tap into native iOS APIs. I decided to do this on iOS only because this is an effect that's kind of natural to use on iOS. On Android, sometimes it is important to get the color of an image and apply that color to other things like the action bar or some other styling of the page. And I may do that in a future video. Let me know down in the comments below if that's something you want to see. But for now, for today, we're going to take that image. I have a bunch of them with different colors, and we're going to get its average color and apply it to the shadow behind it, which also we're going to animate, and the action bar that sits on top of the page. So this is a pretty cool tutorial, and I'm pretty happy to share it with you. Let's begin. We're going to start off with a NativeScript TypeScript application. This is the Hello World template, as we usually do. Why do I start with this template? Because it's the lowest common denominator. Anything you can do in NativeScript Core, you'll be able to do in NativeScript Angular and NativeScript Vue. Pretty much. Here's the main page.ts file. This is the code behind for that page that we see. I'm just going to clean it up a little bit. And we're going to start off with this main page XML, which is the markup. We're going to need to do a couple things here. For example, here is a stack layout. You know what? I'm going to actually turn this into a grid layout so that I can control my layout a little bit better. I'm going to give it some rows. So I want to have a cover image on the top part and a button to click on the bottom part. So I'll give that cover image row a height of 200, and the rest of the page can get the rest of the space. I'm going to delete these labels and just keep the button here. So this button is going to say tap. That's fine. We're going to put this button in row 1. And this tap handler, I want to handle this in code behind and not data bind this to our view model. In fact, we don't even need a view model here. So I'm going to go to the code behind and delete the view model reference. We don't need that. And up here, I'm actually going to place an image. Let's give it an ID so I can get a hold of this image in code. Let's give it a source. Notice I've already added a bunch of images here right in the project. I just dropped them in. These are the covers for a bunch of music albums over the years. I wanted to pick these because they have very vibrant, dominant colors, and that's why I picked these specific ones, just so that we can see the effect better. So let's point this to, let's say, start with cover1.jpg. I'm going to give this a width of 200 and a height of 200 as well. It's a square image. And you know what? Instead of getting this image in code by ID, I'm just going to have a loaded event here. So I'm going to trigger the loaded event. That way we can get to the image by its own loaded event. And I'm going to call this handler image loaded. So there's what we have so far. We have a giant button in the bottom, and we have an album cover at the top there. Not a bad start. We're going to do 3 parts here. One is when I tap this button, I want this album cover to animate, and I want it to increase in size and gently pop. And then when I tap the button again, I want it to decrease in size again to its original size. This is going to simulate the podcast app on iOS. The second part is actually creating the shadow, and I hope you've seen my previous week's tutorial on creating shadows in iOS, all the different parts that are required in creating the shadow. If you haven't checked that video out. And finally, the third part that we're going to do here is making that shadow the same color as the dominant color of the image itself. And we're also going to make the action bar that color. So let's start out by implementing the first part, which is the tap handler here in the code behind. That's the button that we're going to tap to animate the image. So I'm going to implement on tap here. And we need to get a hold of that image in order to animate it. By the way, we're going to use standard NativeScript API animations here, which has a scale on it, so we can use that. So we need to import a few things in order to do that. I'm going to paste in some imports. We're going to import the animation class, the cubic Bezier animation curve, and the animation definition. These are all coming from TNS Core Modules UI animation, which is part of NativeScript. And the way we do that is first we create the animation. It's new animation. It's a new class. We pass it an array of animation definitions, which we're going to create. And then we can just hit the play method on that. So we need some animation definitions here. Let's create a definition, and it's going to be of type animation definition. We want to target that image. So we need to get a hold of the image. There are a couple of ways of doing that. One way is to just store it on the page when the image loads. Let me show you how to do that. So we have this image loaded handler. So when this image loads, it's going to trigger this handler. So I'm going to export a function called image loaded with some args on it of type event data. And the image itself is args.object. We can even cast it as image. And that's exactly what I'll do here. So I need to import image. I'm going to do that right up here. Import image from TNS Core Modules UI image. Now, if we want to access it in this function, we need to make this global to the page. So I can say let img, that's going to be an image. It's going to be null initially. And then when we load the image, I'm going to set it equal to that. And then finally here, I can say target is img. So that's one way of getting the image, but then this reference right here will stick around outside of the scope of our functions. Another way we can get a hold of the image is this onTap handler. So this will also have event data coming in. And in this case, because we're tapping on a button, args.object is actually a button. So we can cast it as a button, which we also need to import. So that's going to be button coming from TNS Core Modules UI button. And then we can go button page, because a button is going to have a reference to its parent page. And then we can say get view by ID and pass in an ID of this image, which actually I removed. But if I did have the ID like this, img, I can just say get view by ID image and get the image that way. But this is fine also, the way we're doing it with the global img variable. So we have a target for this animation definition now. That means we're going to be animating the image. We want to have a duration property. That's a must. And let's do this over 600 milliseconds. I want to animate the scale from smaller to larger, but I want the larger size to be the scale 1. Scale is from 0 to 1. And when it's increasing in size, I want it to end up having x1 and y1. So initially, when the image loads, I want to set the scale start to be smaller than 1. And the reason I do it this way is because what if these images are actually the full resolution at the scale that I set it? And that way, when I increase the scale, it's not going to look good. So I want to set an initial scale that's smaller. Let's go back up to the top here, and I'm going to say const scale start image, and that's going to be, let's say 0.8. So when the image loads right here on image loaded, I want to set its initial scale x to that value, scale start image, and also its scale y property to the same thing so that they're scaling at the same rate. And now this scale will scale it up when I tap the button. So let's pass in this definition 1 into our animation constructor. And I'm going to save everything and try this out. So I'm going to tap this. You can see that the image actually is already scaled down to 0.8 initially. And when I tap this, it's going to scale up. Now, when I tap it again, I want it to scale back down. So it's going to execute this function again, but now I want it to reverse the scaling. So I'm going to have a little flag here that says let rev, or for reverse, equals false. It's just a Boolean flag. And for the scale property, if rev is true, then I'm going to pass it different values for x and y. Let's say x is going to go back down to the initial value, which is scale start image. And the same thing with y. Otherwise, if rev is false, it's going to go to 1, 1. And at the end of this method, I'm just going to flip rev. So I'm going to say rev equals not rev. All right. So I'm going to tap this. It goes up. And I'm going to tap again. It's going to go down. We're almost there with our animation. Now, I also want to use a curve here because it looks kind of ugly being a linear curve this way. So I'm just going to add a curve. And I came up with these numbers using a tool that I like to use, cubicbezier.com. I've shown this tool many times on this channel and the other animation tutorials I've had here. This is the tool right here, and you can change this curve of the animation, and you can even preview it like this. And then you just copy these values right here, which is that curve. So that's what I have here. I came up with a curve that I like. I put it in here with the cubic Bezier animation curve instance. And now our animation is going to look much better. You can see that it even has a little pop or a little bounce towards the end. So that completes our animation step. Now let's figure out the shadow. And you might have seen my shadow tutorial earlier here on this channel. Check that out if you haven't. When the image loads, we're going to use its layer property in iOS. So this is iOS specific. Don't try to run this on Android because it'll break. In fact, we should have a check here for is iOS. And this property is actually set right here. It's accessible through page. It's actually coming from the platform module. But we can do a little check like that to see if it's iOS or not. But if it's not iOS, we can just return. So I'm going to do that because the rest of the code is going to be iOS specific. So I'm going to set image iOS and then layer. We want to set mask to bounds and we want to set that to true. Then I also want to do image iOS layer shadow opacity. So how much of the shadow we see. I'm going to set that to 1. Image iOS dot layer shadow radius. I'm going to set that to 25. And finally, image iOS layer shadow color. And this needs to be an instance of the CG color class, which is in the core graphics of iOS. But we can also get that by using NativeScript color. We'll do that a little bit later in this video. For now, let's just use CG color. Oh, CG color is not recognized. And that's because I didn't install NativeScript platform declarations yet. That's something we need to do. So I'm going to press Control backtick and say npm install TNS platform declarations and save dev. So this is going to install all the iOS specific and Android specific TypeScript declarations, which means in tsconfig, I now need to add skip libcheck and set that to true so that we don't build that library. Otherwise it's going to take too long. And also out here, we need a references file where I need to paste a couple things. So I'm going to go back out here and go to npm.js, TNS platform declarations. This is what we installed just now. This tells you all the instructions of how you need to use that. I've done this before many times on this channel, and that's why I'm doing this really fast now. And right here in references.d.ts, I just need to copy and paste these 2 lines. So I'm going to paste them here. And now we have references to iOS and Android libraries here available in our project, which means that CG color is now a known type in TypeScript, and TypeScript is not going to complain. Sorry, that's not CG color. We need to use UI color. There it is, UI color. And let's go with, I don't know, blue color. And then that has the CG color property on it. Okay, so let's take a look at that. The app restarts and looks like we can't see the shadow yet. And that's actually because I messed up this right here. Mask to bounds should be masks to bounds. And actually true is the default, but we don't want it to mask it to bounds. We want the shadow to be outside of the bounds of the image. So I'm going to set that to false. And now we get that image and the shadow around it, and it's blue. If we want it to be not blue, if we want it to be maybe red, we can do a red shadow as well. But we can also get that average color of the image and apply it to the shadow. And that's the final step. But before we get there, there's one more thing that we need to address. If I have a border radius on this image, which is something that the iOS podcast app actually has on these images, a border radius. And then let's say I set that to 7. Oh, look at that. Our image has a border radius, but the shadow is now gone. And this is something that we can address by wrapping this image up in an absolute layout and then having a label behind it, and then applying the shadow to the label instead of the image directly. So since we want to animate the shadow separately from our image, then I am going to add that layout. I'm going to give it a width of 250 and a height of 250. Remember, we use absolute layouts in order to position elements inside of it absolutely. And what that means is we can give it X and Y coordinates, so we can place objects on top of each other. So here's an absolute layout, and we're going to place this image on top of a label. So I'm going to give it a label with an ID of just LBL. It doesn't need to have text because it's not going to be a visible label. We're just going to use it as a shape behind the image. So let's get a hold of this label in the code. Right when we navigate to the page, this is the hook we want to use for that label. So I'm going to store the label in a variable called LBL, and it's going to be of type label. I'm going to initialize that to null. We also need to import the label. I'll just copy this button here, set this to label, and it's coming from TNS Core Modules UI label. And over here on navigating to, I want to say page, get view by ID. We want to get that LBL as a label, and I'm going to save it in the label variable. Now let's go down here where the image is loaded. Instead of using image and setting the layer shadow on the image, I'm going to do that on the label instead. This is not going to work just yet, and I'll explain why in a second. We don't see anything behind there, and it's because the label doesn't have dimensions. So first we need to set dimensions on this label. Let's go back up here to the navigating to event, and we need to set the height and the width on the label. So I'm going to set it to 200 to start with, but we're going to actually decrease that. If you go take a look at the shapes video, the one I did on shapes on this channel, you'll know that we need 3 things for the label to show up, for a shape to show up: a height, a width, and a background color. So we need to have a background color here as well. Let's set that to red for now. All right, so there we go. We now have an image, a label behind it, and a shadow behind that label. So we want to make sure that that label is always smaller than the image so we don't see it. We're going to hide it. So let's go back up here, and we're going to create a new scale property, scale start label. And we're going to set this to smaller than the image. So let's do 0.5 here. So when the page is navigated to and the label is loaded, I'm going to set the scale here to scale start label. And don't forget the scale Y as well to the same value, scale start label. There it is. So now the label is behind that image, including its shadow. So everything is hidden back there. Now, when I tap this button, the image increases, so we can actually increase the label size as well. So I'm going to go down here to on tap and create a definition 2, an animation definition 2. This time we're going to target the label instead of the image. And let's give it a slightly different duration so it looks pretty cool when it's animated at a different rate. We'll do scale, and we'll use the scale start label as the value here. And I'm also going to use a different curve. I've played around with this before, so I know that this one is going to look pretty good. And also I need to pass in definition 2 into our animation so they play at the same time. Let's check this out. All right, I'm going to tap on this button, and you can see that this animates and the shadow kind of pops up a little bit behind and staggered in time from our image. However, there is a little bit of a problem. You can see the little red corners up there, and we don't want that. So to fix that, I'm going to do a couple things here. Back in the label, I'm going to need the height and the width to be a little bit smaller. So I'm going to decrease it by 12 on each side. But because I decreased it by 12, now it's not going to be centered. So I need to translate the label. So I'm going to say translate X by 6, which is half of 12. And label translate Y also by 6. So now it's going to be centered again. But now when I animate, it's not going to be centered. So not only do I need to animate the scale at this point for the label, I also want to animate the translate, which is going to move it by 6 as it's animating. So X is going to be 6 here, and Y is also going to be 6. Let's check this out. So I'm going to tap on this button. It's going to animate, and there we go. You know what? This button is kind of annoying because it's so big. I'm actually going to remove this class that's on it because that's what's giving it that shape and that color. And now we're just going to get a little tiny iOS tap button right there. And it still works the same way with the animation. All right, so we're almost there. And for most people, this will be enough. If you want to use some kind of decent shadow color like gray, this will be just fine for you. What if you wanted to extract the color from the image and use it for your shadow? This is where part 3 comes in. And here we're going to dive into some really native iOS code to get the average color. I'm going to go down here and create a little function called average color. And this is going to take an image, which is actually a UI image. And that's an iOS image. And it's going to return a UI color. Really, this is a utility function, so you could probably just put this in another file. Don't keep this in your main code behind. You can create a file specifically for iOS, with the .ios.ts extension that has this utility function. All right, let's begin. I'm gonna do some pasting of code and explain it as I go. iOS has different layers for their graphics. UI is the UI kit, and it lives on top of other lower level graphic layers. CG is one of them, core graphics. We've already seen that here when we're getting the CG color from UI color. And CI is another one. So here we're going to take and create a new CI image with the UI image that we've passed in. And then we're going to create something called an extent vector. We're going to use CI vector, and then we're going to pass in all these parts of the CI image to get that vector. Really, I'll be honest with you, I don't know what that is. I found this code on Stack Overflow and I translated it to JavaScript. So this is actually Objective-C code that you can just move the keywords around and make the calls into JavaScript, and then you'll get these functions. So the next step is getting a filter. So you can use a filter called CI area average, which is going to pass in the image and create a filter out of that. Then we need to get a buffer that's going to contain our RGB values for our color, red, green, blue, as well as the A, which is the alpha channel or the opacity. But we're going to focus only on RGB here. We're not going to deal with the A. Still, our buffer is going to have 4 slots in it. And this right here is interop. This is actually something that was implemented with NativeScript. Interop allows you to interact with old style C pointers and C references. So we're going to create a buffer, and then we're going to create a bitmap, which is using interop references. So this is a bitmap reference. And then we're going to use the CI context to create a dictionary that's going to create a rectangle that's 1 by 1 in size. So in other words, what this is doing is essentially taking that image and squashing it down to a pixel that's the size of 1 by 1, and it's taking the average color of that. Finally, this is the final step here. We're going to actually get the color by using UI color. We're going to create a new instance of that, and we're going to take that bitmap and all the different parts of it. So we have the alpha channel, the red channel, the green channel, and the blue channel. And that's going to give us a UI color. And then we can just return that color. So this function right here, average color, is basically Objective-C translated into JavaScript. And you can do that in your NativeScript apps, which is pretty cool. So how do we use that? Well, we need to translate the UI color to NativeScript color. So I'm going to create another function here to do that. I'm going to call this one UI color to NS color. This is going to take in a color, which is a UI color, which is an iOS thing. And it's going to output color, which is actually TNS core modules. It's part of NativeScript. So I'm going to import color, and that's right here. In order to get the color, we need to set up some references for all the values of the color. So I'm going to create all the separate values and the references for them. Let r equals new interop reference 0. And I'm going to do that for red, green, blue, and the alpha channel as well. The reason I need to do that is because you can't just get the different parts of the color from UI color. You need to actually split it up using this function called get red, green, blue, alpha. And that takes in all these interop references that you've seen me create. So we pass in red, green, blue, and alpha in here, and we get the result. There we go. Now that we get that result, we need to create a new NativeScript color from that. And that's pretty easy now. So we're going to return new color. So color takes in either a known color or a hex color or ARGB as a number, or alpha, red, green, and blue, all as separate parameters. And that's what we're going to use, this fourth override for the constructor. So first is alpha, and we want it to be in full color. So I'm going to use 255 here. Then we want the red, which is going to be r.value times 255. Then we want the green, g.value times 255. And finally, we're going to get the blue. We're multiplying this by 255 because here we divided by 255. Just different formats of storing that color information. Awesome. So now we have finally our NativeScript color that we can use directly in our application here. So let's go to where we're loading the image. And over here, I'm going to say let color. This is going to be the UI color. We're going to calculate the average color first by passing in the image. But this is the NativeScript image, remember. So we need to pass in the UI image, which is available on the image source.ios property. So this is the UI image for our image. and then we're going to get the color from that. And now we need to convert that UI color to a NativeScript color. So const ns color equals UI color to ns color, and we're going to pass in that color. And finally, this right here is our NativeScript color, which we can use right here when we create the shadow color. So instead of setting it to a static color like this, we're going to use nscolor.ios, and we want to pass in the CG color property, which is the core graphics version. Let's check this out. So I'm going to tap on this and we get a slightly bluish background. Now to see the big difference here, I'm going to change the image to cover 2. And cover 2 is the Beatles album, which should give us a red shadow. And let's tap on this. And yeah, the shadow is slightly reddish in color. What else do we have here? This one, let's go to 4. Cover 4. Let's check that one out. I'm going to tap on the button and we get a purple shadow. Nice. Now remember, our label actually has a red background that we've set right here. We've hard-coded it. So just in case something doesn't work and some shadow doesn't show up, which is not likely the case, but I just want to be thorough here. So I'm going to set the label background color to this NS color, which is no biggie. Very simple to do. But we also want to change the action bar color, don't we? Yeah, let's do that. Let's set the action bar color to match our average color of the image. So I'm going to give our action bar an ID of action bar. Let's head out to our code, and when we load or navigate to the page, actually I'm going to create an action bar instance out here, set that to null, and I'm just going to say here action bar equals page.getViewById, pass in action bar. I'm not even going to bother typing this. Let's go down here where we have the image loaded. Here I'm going to say action bar dot background color. I'm going to set that to NS color. Now, when we load, we see that the action bar is purple. Nice. And if I change this cover to say this one, so that's 6. Let's go to cover 6. The action bar is now an average color, which is hard to tell from this image. I guess we have orange, we have yellow, we have red, and we have black. So that all combines into a brownish color, I guess. It's probably easier to tell with something like this. Cover 3. Let's go to cover 3. And there we go. There's cover 3, and we have an average color that's kind of greenish like that. It's probably really easy to tell with that cover 2 though when it's really red. So I'm going to change that to cover 2, and there we go. And our tap still works, and the shadow animates out, looking pretty good. So that was pretty neat. Let's take a look at some of your comments from this video that I created also related to iOS. And this is how to create iOS shadows. This is where I explain from scratch some of the techniques that we used in this tutorial. CyanogenGen85 says, nice one again, love it. Suggestions for a couple of tutorials. 1, image loader. Until the image gets downloaded, we show a little loader as feedback that something is going on. I do have 2 tutorials on animated spinners right on this channel. So check that out if you're going to be loading something that's going to take a while and you need to show some kind of spinner. I show you how to create those with CSS and NativeScript widgets only without using any third-party libraries. So if you haven't seen those videos, check them out. And the second idea is image, or rather content carousel with swipe gestures. Yeah, this is a pretty common request. I'm already on that actually. Mark says, hi Alex, great video. Does this only apply to NS6? We tried this with NS5, but it doesn't work. First of all, hey Mark, welcome to my channel. It's good to see you on here. Mark and I met in Amsterdam during the NativeScript Dev Days in 2019. And to answer your question, yes, this is an iOS feature and it's been in there for quite a long time. It's part of the layer API, or the CA layer API that lives underneath of UIKit. So it's been there for a while and you can use this. It's not dependent on a NativeScript version because you're talking to the native APIs underneath of NativeScript. Dean says, cool video, many great tips in here. Thanks. And thanks for your comment, Dean. Welcome. Alexandro Claudio Antonica says, Alex, great video. I'm wondering if you know any way to use ClipPath to take an SVG file to create a mask for a container in NativeScript. I think you'd have to use some kind of third-party tool in order to generate a mask from an SVG file. I actually don't know of any tool like that, but if you found one or if anybody else found one, please comment down below. I would love to do a tutorial on this and how to use it with NativeScript. So if I understood you correctly, we're looking for a tool that's going to take an SVG file and basically generate a clip path for it that you can later use in NativeScript. Very good idea. Afnan Shaikh says, "Hi Alex, can this be done in Android?" Well, even though I've only shown how to do this in iOS, Android actually has a built-in feature called elevation, and that's already available in NativeScript 6, although I'm not sure if colors are supported. I don't think colors are supported, but you can create shadows on Android using elevation. So check out the NativeScript documentation for that. And Mark again says, "One more question, can the iOS drop shadow be applied to a layout?" And the answer is yes, you can apply it to a layout. I have actually tried this myself. Even though I didn't show it in this tutorial, you can apply shadows to layouts because layouts are also UI views, just like NativeScript widgets. And in iOS, UI views have a layer underneath. Thanks everybody for your questions. And again, if you haven't subscribed yet, please subscribe to this channel and click the little bell so you don't miss any tutorials, tips, or tricks that we got coming up. And if you want to connect with me, I'm @DigitAlex on Twitter, and I'll catch you in the next video.